Hello, very beautiful community. We've got to set the record straight. Who's been this countryside Vlad guy? He's been broadcasting to you in my best jumper. He's out-jumped my jumper game and he's looked very cozy and tremendously cuddly in his jumper from the countryside. He's been doing chats and he's even done something on the main channel. We need to get to the bottom of this. He looks like a very nasty guy, taking advantage of me, taking my jumper, and looking very cozy in the countryside. So if you see him again, just let me know, because I don't know what's going on. I've got to figure out what's going on. We're going to read together General Kellogg's interview with the New York Post. Usually I prefer to take a peek and summarize something for us, but sometimes it's nice to get a more big picture and maybe even kind of visceral reaction by reading something together. So let's do it. I'm joking, beautiful community. There's actually only one, Vlad. And he's transported himself from the countryside back to East London. So let's get on with it. The New York Post says President Trump is prepared to increase US sanctions for Russia to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine. Retired General Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy on the conflict, exclusively told the Post this week. But he also knows that both sides will have to make concessions to end the industrial-sized killing in Europe's largest country. So far, so good? Or not. So far, what we're hearing is that General Kellogg is saying that Trump is prepared to increase sanctions, which is fine, for Russia to bring about an end to the war. So this is not just a claim about Trump increasing sanctions. This is a claim about Trump being willing and able to increase sanctions in such a way as to significantly impact the process of the negotiations from the Russian point of view. And that is impossible. We'll come back to that, but that's a pipe dream. There is no such lever available to the President of the United States with a short-term effect. I'm sure this will be coming back to us during the interview, so we'll probably speak about it in a moment. Sanctions enforcement on Russia is only 3 out of 10, Kellogg said. 3 out of 10 on how painful economic pressure can be. The US sanctions themselves, such as those targeting Russia's lucrative energy sector, are nominally twice as high, but there is still room to ratchet them up. You could really increase the sanctions, especially the latest sanctions targeting oil production and exports. It's opened the aperture way high to do something. Well, let's just go on. And if there is anybody who understands leverage, it's President Donald J. Trump. And you can see that with what he's recently done in other foreign problem solving. He certainly solved the problem in Gaza tremendously strongly. The last Thursday, Trump gathered his whole confirmed team of advisors and cabinet members focused on national security, from DJ Vance to Scott Bessent in the Oval Office, where Kellogg said they discussed how to use all elements of national power to end the war. Though Kellogg said Ukraine will need to keep up its military pressure on Russia ahead of negotiations, he lambasted former President Joe Biden's strategy of promising to provide Ukraine aid as long as it takes, as much as it takes, without cranking up the pressure of other elements of national power. This is not a strategy, it's a bumper sticker, Kellogg says. And we have discussed how as long as it takes is indeed not just a bumper sticker, but a policy that was a placeholder that was meant to keep Ukraine afloat without the vision or the capacity to execute on a vision of any strategic kind toward the conflict. And I said that this was secondary to democratic decline at home. So I've linked, as you know very well historically, the lack of Western strategy in that conflict and indeed in other conflicts to an increasing absence of democratic capacity at home. At a very high level, I said, okay, this is Kellogg speaking, the Biden administration was not really prosecuting the war or helping out Ukraine as well as they should have, getting Ukraine the necessary arms or strategy at the right time. Working with President Trump, he saw that, and he said early on, I mean, even a year ago, I was on the campaign trail with him and we talked about demographics, the losses and the absolute scourge of the war, and I said, this is World War II level violence, Kellogg said, noting that's why Trump is focused on using a holistic approach to end the brutal conflict. So we've had a remark about the sanctions, and we have now had a remark about help for Ukraine, including military assistance, presumably. Now, there is absolutely nothing that Kellogg can do in the face of the systemic challenges around giving Ukraine more military support than was the experience of the Biden administration, unless they specify what they have in mind, right? Until they do, these are just empty words. This is just a weaker and less well-organized version of the Biden approach. Even though it's expressed as criticism of the Biden approach, because the fear of escalation, galvanizing of means and resources, coordinating what is given to Ukraine, making sure Ukraine gets what it needs when it needs, problems around all of these dimensions, right, are going to be the same for the Trump administration. So I don't buy so far what we've heard about the sanctions. I'll say a word about sanctions in a moment. And I certainly don't buy for a moment what's said about Biden not doing enough for Ukraine. Well, how are you going to do more? What are you going to do? Now, I don't think nothing can be said about that, but that's certainly not a way of, seriously sharing policy. While the president this week has floated possible deal-making with Ukraine over access to its rare earth elements, so again, this is a non-story, the rare earth elements. This is Trump just not being sufficiently informed about Ukraine. Kellogg said the president first wants to stop the killing, just stop it, and then you can go on from there. I think we have some opportunities, and fortunately, I am working for the master deal maker who wrote The Art of the Deal, and I wouldn't put anything past him. So far we've got hot air on sanctions. We have got rhetorical gas critiquing Biden for problems they don't know how to solve either. And now we have this sort of empty stuff about the art of the deal, which is in fact increasingly a substitute for what is missing so far, which is security guarantees. Ukraine can get, let's just be logical here. I'm not being practical, I'm just saying what's logically available. Ukraine can get nukes. Ukraine can get into NATO. Neither of these are options, realistically. So, therefore, Ukraine can get Western troops. How are you going to do that, Mr. Trump? Mr. Kellogg, how are you going to do it? Have you got a plan for that? Right? It's the most realistic way to provide guarantees for Ukraine. If you're not going to do that, if you're going to leave that to Europeans, you don't have much leverage over Mr. Putin. You just don't. The goal is to end the violence before negotiations. such that you can deal with the peace settlement intricacies later. You can't kill your way out of the war, Kellogg says. For Russia, this is kind of in their DNA in military operations. Basically, you're in an attrition fight, Kellogg says. If you look at their history, you never want to get into an attrition fight with the Russians because that's how they fight. They're used to it. I mean, this is a country that was willing to lose and did lose 700,000 in the Battle of Stalingrad in 6 months, and they didn't blink an eye. So Ukraine and Russia can both carry on the war. I'm not going to sort of thread it out now, but my analysis is that that's probably more dangerous for Ukraine than for Russia at the moment, looking at the economic situation in both countries, looking at the state of the military, the state of mobilization, looking at political stability of the governments. But both can. But neither can without greater cost they hadn't incurred before. The war will become even more existential for Ukraine and a little bit more existential for Russia at a societal level if they carry it on. But both can. So this isn't a situation where both or even one of the sides are just running out of runway completely. And so the pressure can't just be military. You have to put economic pressure, you have to put diplomatic pressure, some types of military pressures and levers that you're going to have to use underneath to make sure that they go where they need to go. So sanctions are, let's just say a word about sanctions at this point, a radioactive matter. And so what we've seen is, for anybody who wants Putin's war to stop, a disconcertingly healthy export market for the Russians across the majority of their exports, and then some quite catastrophic collapses in some of their export market, but not in most of it. Now, this won't last for the Russians because they've taken advantage of price increases as a compensatory mechanism for the constriction of the market. So that bubble they're riding will increasingly diminish. But we're talking radioactive impact sort of 2027, 2028. We're not talking something that will impact them in the next 6 months in some kind of dramatic way. We're certainly not talking about major levers the President of the United States can pull that will then immediately impact the predicament of the Russians within 6 to 12 months. Trump can do some things that'll impact the Russians, but it's not going to be dramatic enough and short-term enough to be a central feature of the bargaining at the negotiation table. So whatever is the truth about sanctions, very roughly, that it's a sort of a radioactive contamination process for the Russian economy, but it's slow. And so you're not going to build that into a central lever in the negotiations. And Putin knows that, right? Putin is wondering, is Trump bullshitting or is he perhaps delusional? But Putin knows that. Very frankly, both sides of their negotiation have to give, Kellogg says, and that's just the way it is in negotiations. And that's where you have to find out, okay, where is this at? What's acceptable? Is it going to be agreeable to everybody? No. Is it going to be acceptable to everybody? No. But you have to try and find the balance. What about security guarantees? Do you have anything to say about who, if not you, is going to give Ukraine security guarantees? Because without security guarantees, it's not even clear that Ukraine has a sound negotiating position. After a meeting with Zelensky at Trump Tower in September, Trump discussed the reality of bringing Ukraine and Russia to the table, noting not only that it's time for a peace agreement, but an agreement could be made that's good for both sides, Kellogg said. He also added, an analogy to the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which we don't need to read. That's it. Okay, so this is a sort of a presentation of a fuzzy continuation of Biden's policy, but in the context of an administration that speaks in cacophonous voices, with bluster about sanctions outside the realm of cause and effect, right? You don't have a way here to do X to produce result Y in time frame Z to get Putin seriously inflected in the way he is positioned in the negotiation process. You've got nothing here about security guarantees, and you've got nothing here about how you can support Ukraine militarily better than Biden did. The tone of toughness toward the Russians is reassuring. Is it ubiquitous across the Trump administration? No. It's not just the West that's continuing to speak in the cacophony of voices about Ukraine. The Trump administration is itself somewhat cacophonous on this. So at the moment, this gives nothing for US capacity to inflect Putin into a deal that works for Ukraine. So that's my only comment on it. I apologize it's that pessimistic. Lots of love.